I stood in my daughter's driveway with a single rolling suitcase at my feet. The zipper on the front pocket broken since the last time I'd used it, which was my husband's funeral. That was 11 months before. I knocked on the door of the house I'd helped them move into. The house where I'd painted the nursery. The house where my granddaughter had taken her first steps on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was sitting right there on that floor. My son-in-law answered. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at me, and then he told me there wasn't room. My name is Vivienne, I'm 54 years old, and 16 months ago I had just lost everything in the span of about 90 days. Let me back up. My husband of 26 years, Gerald, died in October. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't give you warning, just a diagnosis and then a countdown that moves faster than you're prepared for. From the moment the doctor said the word to the moment I was standing at a gravesite in a coat that didn't keep out the wind, it was less than 5 months. He was 61. He was supposed to retire the following spring. We had a trip to Portugal planned for May. Gerald handled our finances. I know how that sounds now, I know. But we came from a generation where that was just the way things were divided, and I had my own work. I'd run the front office at an orthodontist practice for 19 years, managing schedules, billing, insurance claims, staff, everything. So it wasn't like I was helpless. I just didn't know the passwords. I didn't know which accounts held what or what was in his name only. Or that he'd taken out a second mortgage on the house 3 years earlier to cover a business loan that had gone sideways. I found all of this out in pieces. The way you find things out when someone dies without having made it easy for you. A letter here. A phone call from a bank there. A document that arrives in the mail and sits on the kitchen table while you stare at it trying to understand what it means. What it meant, in the end, was that the house we'd lived in for 22 years was not going to stay mine. I won't walk through every detail of the financial unraveling, because honestly I still don't fully understand parts of it, and also because this isn't a story about money. It's about what happened when I needed help and where that help did and did not come from. I have 2 children. My daughter Cecily is 31, married to a man named Douglas, 2 kids under 5, lives about 40 minutes from where I grew up. My son Felix is 28, lives in Phoenix, works in software, not married, keeps his apartment cold enough to store meat. I love them both unreservedly. I want to say that clearly before I tell you what happened. I called Cecily first. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, which was hard because I was still in the phase where saying things out loud made them feel more real, and I wasn't sure I wanted them more real. I told her the house situation wasn't looking good. That I had some money in my own savings account. Not a lot, not nearly enough. That my job was still there, but the salary wasn't going to cover both rent and living in this area on its own. I told her I might need somewhere to land for a little while, just until I figured out the next step. She said she'd talk to Douglas. That pause before "I'll talk to Douglas." If you've ever heard it, you know what it sounds like. It sounds like the answer is already no, and you're just being given a few hours to prepare for it. She called back the next evening. She said Douglas felt like it would be too disruptive for the kids. That their routine was really important right now. That she hoped I understood and that of course they would help in other ways, whatever that meant. I said I understood. I didn't, but I said it. I drove over 2 days later anyway. Not to argue, just because I needed to see my grandchildren, Rosie and the baby, Theo. And because sometimes you need to be in a room with people who love you even if the love is currently failing to show up in the way you need it to. Cecily answered the door. She looked a little like she'd been hoping I wouldn't come, which was its own kind of hurt. I came in. The kids were wonderful. Rosie showed me a drawing she'd made of a dog that looked like a rectangle with legs, and I told her it was the best dog I'd ever seen, because it was the best dog, it was everything. Douglas came home while I was there. He was pleasant. He asked how things were going. I said fine, in the same way you say fine when things are not fine, and he nodded, and went to change out of his work clothes and didn't come back downstairs for 20 minutes. When he did, he brought his laptop and sat at the kitchen table and started working, which I recognized as a signal. I stayed another hour. I hugged the kids. I picked up the baby and held him longer than I needed to. Long enough that Cecily noticed and put her hand on my shoulder for a moment, which was something. When I left, she walked me to the car. She said, "Mom, You know we'd help if we could. I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. Their house has 4 bedrooms. Rosie has her own room, the baby has his, Douglas has an office, and the 4th room has a treadmill in it and some bins of Christmas decorations. I know because I helped them organize it. I called Felix from the driveway before I started the car. He answered on the 3rd ring, which for Felix means he was paying attention. I gave him the short version. He listened. There was a pause that was different from Cecily's pause. Not calculating, more like genuinely uncomfortable. Mom, he said, Phoenix is really far. I said I knew. He said, I mean I've got a 1-bedroom. I said I knew that too. I could send you some money, he said. Like, to help with a deposit or whatever. That was more than Cecily had offered in concrete terms, and I love him for it. And it still wasn't what I needed, which was a place to sleep while I figured out what came next. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in that driveway for a minute and I did not let myself cry. Because I had learned in the past 5 months that crying in a car in front of someone else's house was a particular kind of lonely I didn't want to sit inside. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table in the house I was losing and I made myself take stock of what I actually had. I had a job. 20 hours a week currently, but I'd been half-time since Gerald got sick because I needed the flexibility. I could ask for full-time. I didn't know if they'd give it to me, but I could ask. I had my car, a 6-year-old Subaru with 87,000 miles on it, and a heating system that worked fine. I had $11,400 in a savings account that I'd been slowly building on my own over the last decade. Just a habit my mother had drilled into me. Always have money that's just yours. She'd told me when I got married, so I had. I had Gerald's life insurance, which was not a large policy but was something. It was tied up in processing. I had a sister, Meredith in Raleigh, who had already told me in not so many words that her husband wasn't keen on houseguests, and I had decided to save both of us the conversation. I had good credit, which felt like a bitter kind of irony given that I was about to need it badly. And I had a very clear memory of standing at Gerald's grave in that cold coat. Thinking, I have to be different now. I have to be someone who knows the passwords. I found a room to rent through a woman at my church named Eunice, who was 67, and renting a room in her house, because she was on a fixed income and it helped. It was a real room, not a closet, with a window that looked out onto her backyard and a shared bathroom down the hall, and a small dresser that had belonged to her late mother. It cost $650 a month. It was the proud I'd felt since I was 23 and sleeping on an air mattress in my first apartment. It was also, I want to be honest about this, a relief. To have somewhere. To have a door that closed and a window and a place to put my clothes. I moved in on a Tuesday in March. I fit what I needed into the Subaru plus a small storage unit for the things I wasn't ready to let go of. I left Gerald's old recliner with Cecily because the grandkids liked it. I donated most of the furniture because there wasn't time to be sentimental. And also because being sentimental was going to flatten me. And I didn't have the luxury of being flattened. The next morning I called my supervisor at the orthodontist office, a man named Dr. Sato, who had known me for the better part of 2 decades and who I had watched go from a new associate to a practice owner in that time. I told him I needed to talk. He said, come in. I sat down in his office and I said I needed full-time hours and I needed them as soon as he could manage it. I told him what had happened briefly, just the structure of it. He didn't say I'm so sorry the way some people did, which was fine, but he also didn't make me say anything twice. He said, I should have asked you sooner. We need the coverage. Full-time starting the following Monday. Benefits I'd been partially off since going part-time. A salary that, with my half of Gerald's life insurance once it finally came through, meant I could actually see a path. I want to skip over the middle of this. Not because it wasn't hard, but because the hard parts aren't really the point. There were months where I ate a lot of soup, because it was cheap and hot, and I could make a big pot and live off it for 4 days. There were nights I sat on the edge of the bed in Eunice's house, and listened to the sounds of a home that wasn't mine, and thought about the specific dimensions of every room in the house. I'd lived in for 22 years, trying to memorize it before the memory faded. There were weeks where I was so tired from working full-time, and trying to understand financial and legal documents that had suddenly become my problem, that I'd fall asleep at 8:30 and wake up not sure what day it was. There was also Eunice, who would sometimes knock on my door in the evenings and say she'd made too much of something. Which was not true, she'd made exactly enough. She'd just made extra for me. And I started to understand that kindness from unexpected places is not lesser kindness. It's just differently sourced. There was also something I did the second week I was living in that room, sitting at the little desk by the window, that I want to tell you about specifically. I opened a bank account in only my name, set up automatic transfers for $200 a month into it, and I promised myself I would not touch it for any reason that wasn't an actual emergency. Not a grocery emergency. An actual one. I also signed up for a free financial literacy course online, the kind of thing I would have waved off at any other point in my life as something I didn't need. And I sat there at that desk by the window, and I learned things I should have known at 25. About credit. About estate planning. About what a second mortgage means. About the way paperwork that seems like nothing can become everything when someone isn't there to explain it anymore. I am not embarrassed that I didn't know these things before. I'm only committed to knowing them now. The job grew. Dr. Sato's practice was in the middle of expanding, adding a second location across town, bringing on 2 new associates, suddenly needing someone who could manage not just the scheduling and billing for one office but for 2. I had been doing versions of this work for 19 years. I knew the systems. I knew the insurance codes. I knew how to handle a patient who was frustrated, and a staff member who was overwhelmed, and a vendor who was trying to overcharge us, and a doctor who needed to be reminded that his charm was not a substitute for completing his documentation. By August, Dr. Sato asked me if I wanted to take on the office manager role officially, with a formal title and a salary that landed with a weight I wasn't prepared for. I said yes before he finished the question. It wasn't a fortune. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't a corner office or a company car. It was a salary that meant I could start looking at my own apartment. A real one. Not a room in someone's house. Not a compromise. An apartment in a part of town I actually wanted to live in. With a kitchen I could cook in, and a parking spot, and enough square footage that Rosie could spend the night, when Cecily eventually asked if she could. I found a 1-bedroom in a complex near a small lake that had a walking path around it. It cost more per month than the room at Eunice's. But it was mine, and the lease was in my name, and I signed it on a Wednesday afternoon, and sat in the empty living room on the floor for a few minutes just to feel what it felt like, to have a room that belonged to me again. I bought a plant. Small, a pothos, because they're hard to kill and I needed something in my corner. I hung curtains before I brought the furniture in. Dark green ones that looked good against the white walls. And I stood back and looked at them and thought, here we go. The divorce of assets, the settling of Gerald's estate, the handling of the house, the second mortgage, the business loan. All of it took most of the year. I hired an attorney to help me navigate it. It cost money I was careful about spending. She was thorough and patient, and did not let the bank who held the second mortgage talk me into things that weren't in my interest, which they tried to do at least twice. There wasn't a lot left over at the end. But there was something. Gerald had meant well. He'd just made some decisions in a hard few years and hadn't found the right moment to tell me. And then he ran out of moments, and I'm at peace with that now in a way I wasn't for a long time. I did not hear much from Cecily and Douglas during this period. A few texts, a dinner in there somewhere, a little stiff, the kind where you can feel everyone trying not to talk about the thing everyone is thinking about. She would send pictures of the kids, which I was grateful for. Rosie had gotten into a phase of wearing only purple. Theo had started pulling himself up on furniture and looking very pleased with himself about it, which was familiar to me because Felix had done the same thing 30 years ago and had that same expression. About 6 months after I moved into the apartment, Cecily called. Not a text, an actual call which I noticed. She said she wanted to get together, just the 2 of us, and could I come for lunch on Saturday? I went. We sat at her kitchen table. Douglas was out somewhere with the kids, which I suspected was intentional. She was quiet for a moment after she poured the coffee and then she said, I want to say I'm sorry, Mom. For the spring. For not. She stopped, tried again. Douglas and I talked about it a lot after, and I think I let him take the lead on a decision that should have been mine, and I'm sorry. I let her finish. I looked at my coffee cup for a moment. I know you are, I said, and I meant it. I wasn't holding on to the anger anymore by then. I'd put it down somewhere in the fall. Not because it wasn't valid, but because carrying it around was getting in the way of paying attention to my own life. And my life had started to require my full attention in a way that was actually interesting. I want things to be okay between us, she said. They're okay, I said, and then I said something I'd been thinking for a while. But I'm not the same person I was before Gerald died, or before that spring. Some things shifted and I don't think they'll shift back. That's not bad. It's just true. She nodded. She looked like she was trying not to cry. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. We talked for 2 hours that afternoon. It was better than it had been. It's gotten better since. Douglas sent me a text about 3 weeks later, separate from Cecily, which surprised me, just a short one. He said he knew an apology over text wasn't really enough, but he wanted me to know he was sorry for how things had gone in the spring, and he hoped we could move forward. I read it twice. I wrote back something short that said I appreciated him saying so. We haven't talked about it since, and that's fine. Some things get resolved without requiring a whole scene. Felix came to visit in the fall. He stayed in my apartment on the pull-out couch I'd bought specifically for the possibility of him visiting. Which tells you something about how I spent some of that first paycheck as office manager. He brought me a plant. Not knowing I'd already started a small collection on the windowsill. A snake plant this time, because he said they were impossible to kill, which made 2 of us. We cooked dinner together one night and walked around the lake path the next morning, and he asked me, straight up, how I was really doing, and I told him honestly. Pretty well, I said. Better than I expected. Different from what I planned, he said. Dad would think this was kind of impressive, you know. I hadn't thought about it that way. I thought about it for the rest of the walk. There is a particular kind of accounting you start to do when you're in your 50s and things fall apart. It's different from when you're younger, when you're in your 30s and something crumbles. You have this sense that there's still plenty of time to rebuild, that you can lose a decade and still have decades left. At 54, the math feels different. The margins seem smaller. You catch yourself thinking not about what could be but what's left, and whether it's enough. What I learned in those 16 months is that the margins are only as small as you decide they are. The house I grew up in, the 26-year marriage, the assumptions I'd built my whole life around. They're gone. Gerald is gone. The version of me who didn't know the passwords, who assumed everything was fine because she wasn't the one holding the paperwork, she's gone too. But what replaced her is someone I trust more, someone who reads the documents, who has her own accounts, who knows the difference between what she needs and what she's willing to accept. Eunice and I still have dinner once a month. I bring wine, she makes something with too much butter, and we sit in her kitchen and talk for hours. She's become one of my closest friends. I did not see that coming from a $650 room I moved into out of desperation. Last spring, Rosie's kindergarten had a grandparents' breakfast. I always go. Rosie had made a little place card for my seat with my name on it, and a drawing of us holding hands, which she'd been working on in secret for 2 weeks according to Cecily, who was suspiciously emotional about it when she told me. Rosie sat next to me the whole breakfast, working her way through a stack of pancakes with great focus and concentration. And at some point she looked up at me and said, out of nowhere, the way only a 5-year-old can do, "Grandma, you have your own apartment now," I said. I do. She thought about this for a moment. Is it nice? I told her it was very nice, that it had a walking path by a lake and 4 plants on the windowsill and a pull-out couch that was specifically for visitors. She said, "Can I visit?" I said, "You're at the top of the list." She went back to her pancakes. I drank my coffee and looked around at the other grandparents sitting in those small chairs at the small tables, and I felt something that I didn't have a clean word for. Not happiness exactly. Or not only that. Something more like groundedness. Like I was standing in a place I'd actually chosen and built rather than landed in by default. I don't tell this story because I want you to feel sorry for me. I don't. I have a job that uses every skill I have. I have an apartment with my name on the lease and plants on the windowsill and a granddaughter who draws pictures of us holding hands. I'm going to be fine. I already am mostly on most days. I tell it. Because I know there are women listening to this, who are somewhere in the middle of something that cracked open without warning. Who are figuring out the paperwork, and the passwords, and the accounts, while also just trying to get through the week. Who asked for help from someone who was supposed to give it and got a door that closed instead? Here is what I want to say to you. Open your own account. Learn the documents. Find the Eunice. She exists. She might be a coworker or a neighbor or a woman at your church or someone you haven't met yet. But she's there. And she will make dinner with too much butter. And she will knock on your door when she has made too much of something. And that will matter more than you think. And the people who closed the door. Not because they're monsters, most of them aren't, but because they were scared or selfish, or just let someone else make the decision that should have been theirs. They will come back around eventually. Or they won't, and you will have built something solid enough by then that, either way, you'll be okay. The morning I signed my apartment lease, I sat in the empty living room on the floor, and I thought about the driveway I'd sat in 11 months before, outside Cecily's house, not letting myself cry. I thought about the room at Eunice's. The desk by the window, the soup, the financial literacy course at 10 o'clock at night after a full day of work. I thought about Gerald, who would have hated that it went the way it did, and who also, I think, would have recognized something in who I became on the other side of it. I didn't whisper anything to nobody. I just sat there and looked at the empty walls of my empty apartment and thought, quietly to myself, look at what happened. If you are standing somewhere right now that feels like the wrong place, or like there's no place, I want you to know that the place you build yourself is always the one that fits best. It is the one no one can close the door on, because you hold the lease, and it is yours. And you earned every square foot. Tell me in the comments. If someone closed a door on you when you needed it open, what did you find on the other side? Because I think this community knows something about that. And I think we're all still finding out.